So today we're still in chapter 13, looking at our ASAD model. So this is a model of the short run. We've been looking at the various curves involved in the model. We learned about the aggregate demand curve earlier, and also about the long run aggregate supply. So right now we're going to look at the short run aggregate supply. So this part of the model, like I said before, is not symmetric in the sense that while there's a long run, short run aggregate supply, there is no long or short run aggregate demand, just one aggregate demand curve. So that's a little bit different from what you saw back in micro, where there's one supply curve, one demand curve. So the short aggregate supply curve is going to have this positive slope. Remember, our graph has real GDP over here on the x-axis, and you have price on the y-axis. So first we'll learn about why the slope is positive, and then we'll look at what shifts the SRAS. So the first reason is that inputs, things like your raw materials, your ingredients, your labor, those have inflexible prices. So many times those inputs, I think I mentioned things like labor and your raw materials, those are their prices set in contracts. So what that means is that the price is locked in until that contract expires. Now, on the other hand, the output price, the price of the final good, is much more flexible. So there's a gap between the flexibility of the input prices and the output prices. So to show the slope is positive, we've got to show that an increase in the price will eventually lead to an increase in real GDP. So kind of the opposite of the logic we were doing with the aggregate demand curve, where you had this negative relationship. So let's suppose prices rise. Now what that would do is if you sell your goods for more money, but your costs are still the same because your costs were locked in with these contracts, is you'll want to sell more. That's because when price goes up and your costs are fixed, some goods that would have been just barely break even or a little bit unprofitable now become profitable. So you want to take advantage of that if you are a firm. So when firms are producing more, what does that do to real GDP? Well, more production, of course, means higher real GDP. So you get an increase in price ultimately leading to an increase in real GDP. So that's going to give you a positive slope on your SRAS curve, short run aggregate supply. So that's our first reason. So let's move on to our second reason. So reason number 2 is menu costs. So we looked at menu costs way back in chapter 8, so several weeks ago. That was our inflation chapter. So the whole list of 7 costs of inflation, so 7 problems that inflation causes for the economy. And one of those was menu costs. And the idea there was that it costs money for firms to change their prices. So the term comes from restaurants. If a restaurant wants to update its prices, they got to print new menus. That means spending money on paper and ink. That money goes to paper and ink. Could have been better spent somewhere else. Now, even firms that are not restaurants also face menu costs. That's because you want to change your price tags. Again, got to spend money on paper and ink. So in general, menu costs are the cost of changing prices. So before we talk about this as one of the many costs of inflation, so the more inflation you have, the more frequently you have to update your prices, which means the more money you spend on paper and ink. But it's also as a second role of being a reason for the positive slope of the SRAS curve. So let's say prices are rising again, the rest of the economy. But due to menu costs, one firm might decide to keep the prices the same for now. So if raising your prices gives you maybe $10 more of revenue, but it costs $20 to print new menus, it's not worth it. So just because you have overall rising cost won't always give you rising prices, because you got to overcome that menu cost. You got to make enough money for the new prices to recover the cost of printing those new menus. So at some point, of course, if the price level rises far enough, they will at some point eventually update their prices, but maybe not right away. So in the short run, you might have the same prices. So you think about what's going to happen at that firm. They have the same prices. Everybody else is raising their prices. What consumers are going to do is they're going to start going to the firm that has the lower prices. So the firm that keeps the prices the same is going to get more business. So what's the firm to do when they get more business? They got to make more stuff. And when firms start producing more, that's going to lead to real GDP rising. So once again, we find that if we increase price at the end of our story, we get an increase in real GDP. So that gives you a positive slope on your SRAS curve. So we showed this back earlier with our graph here. So higher price, meaning higher real GDP, kind of have a positive slope. So that's our second reason for the SRAS curve's positive slope. We have one more to look at. And the third reason is money illusion. So money illusion was also from chapter 8, our inflation chapter. It was among our 7 costs of inflation. And this one referred to people confusing nominal and real. So if you get maybe you get a 2% raise at your work, so 2% more money, but prices are 3% higher, you're not actually richer, you're poorer. A 2% raise is not enough to cover the higher costs of 3% higher prices. So that'd be what money illusion would look like. You think you're richer because you got 2% more money, but you're actually poor because of higher prices. But we said back in chapter 8, this is a very dubious idea. I know your book talks about it as if it were a fact, but actually modern macro models don't have money illusion, and for good reason. So I would not put a whole lot of confidence in this third reason here, but the first two are much more reasonable for why the SRAS curve will have a positive slope. Nevertheless, we will go through it anyways, just so you guys see how the logic works. So let's say prices are falling. So what the firm would want to do when they're facing falling prices is they want to negotiate lower wages. And they could do that because if your dollar now has more buying power due to lower prices, I could pay you less money and you're just as well off. So you have 10% less money, but things are 10% cheaper. You are just as well off now as you were in the past. Let's imagine people have money illusion. So in that example where you have 10% lower prices and I'm paying you 10% less, if you confuse nominal and real, you might think that 10% nominal wage cut is actually a 10% real wage cut. So if you lost 10% of your wage at work, you're going to be really unhappy about that. Odds are going to be when you're negotiating that with your boss, you're just going to refuse to accept it. So while the firms would like to reduce the nominal wage, they can't actually do it. So the wage won't actually change, and what that would do then is reinforce our first reason, which again was inflexible input prices. I didn't mention one of our inputs is labor, so the price of labor is the wage, and now we're saying the wage can't go down. That's going to make the input prices even more inflexible. So that's why the SRAS curve has a positive slope. All right, so now we understand why it has this positive slope. We now look at what's going to shift the SRAS. So first thing to know, everything that shifts the LRAS curve also shifts the SRAS curve. And I listed out last time all the things that go into that. So those are three main drivers of long-run growth. So some things you should definitely know for the exam. What drives long-run growth? So he says the list was resources, technology, and institutions. And it makes sense why that would happen, because things that help you out in the long run also help you in the short run. So if you find more natural resources, that's going to help you long term. But more natural resources also help you today. Same for technology. Technology helps you long term with your growth. Technology also helps you immediately with growth. So it makes sense why they'd shift SRAS as well as LRAS. For institutions, remember we had 5 of those. So those institutions were, we had private property rights and political stability, rule of law, efficient taxes, competitive open markets, and lastly we had stable money and prices. So all those institutions would help us not just long term but also short term. So we talked about things like you had less inflation that help out with long term investment. Investors be able to face less uncertainty with stable money and prices. Lower inflation though also helps you right away. So things help in the long run, also help in the short run. So why are this different SRS curve when the SRS curve is shifted by all the same things as LRS? Well, the answer is there are some things that shift SRS alone without shifting LRS. So let's talk about those. So the first one on our list is we'll call supply shocks. So like I said, I'm at economics conference right now, and if you go to an economics conference, you'll hear the word shock quite a bit. So by a supply shock, we mean a surprise event that changes a firm's production costs. So that's where the shock part comes from, the surprise element. So we can't anticipate these events. And there are many examples of supply shocks. So one example out of many, you go back to 2008, back when there was the financial crisis, of course, but another event that happened around that time that was a big deal for the economy was a large increase in oil prices. I guess we also had one more recently back in like 2021, 2022. So I guess I could update my example with that. Which year was it? 2021 or 2022? I think it was 2022. Could be off a little bit. And the price of oil is a very, very important price in the economy because many things depend, at least implicitly, on oil. So if your firm wants to bring their goods from the factory to the marketplace, they probably put them on a truck. That truck uses oil. And just to produce the goods, your factory has to use energy, and that energy might involve oil at some point in the production process. So how firms respond to these higher costs? Well, if you're thinking about it a bit, there are some goods that were profitable and some that are just barely profitable, some that are just barely break even. When your costs get higher unexpectedly like this, then those goods that are just barely profitable now become unprofitable. So firms don't want to be unprofitable, so what they're going to do It's going to start producing less. Those just barely profitable items no longer get produced anymore. So when firms responded by slashing production, that's going to shift our SRS curve back. So our diagrams look kind of like this. So here's our original SRS curve, and then when it's going to be shifted back, it'll look like this, because as you can see, when you do that, then at any given price, there is now less production than there was in the past. So this price level, for example, used to produce this quantity, this amount of real GDP, now producing a lower quantity because, again, we stopped producing those goods that were just barely profitable, that became unprofitable. Now, supply shocks are temporary, so this is not going to be the end of the story. What's going to happen is that once oil prices start going back to normal, like they did a year or so later in both cases, 2008 and 2022, then the SRS curve is going to bounce back. So to be a supply shock, it also has to be a temporary event. If it's a permanent event, now we're talking about something that's just the LRS curve, not the SRS curve. So that's one factor that shifts SRS without shifting the LRS curve. We have one more though. So the other factor that shifts SRS alone is going to be expected future prices. So that might sound familiar, and that's because it is. If you go back to your notes from earlier in this chapter, you might see that we talked about expected future prices also shifting aggregate demand. So this one factor shifts actually two curves, not just that one aggregate demand curve. So it's important to understand why this will shift SRS, because we'll use this kind of reasoning quite a bit in the future chapters, so pay close attention here. So we're thinking about what workers want to do when they're thinking that prices are going to go up. So if you think you'll face higher prices, you're not going to be content to keep working for the same wage. That same wage will buy fewer goods once the inflation arrives. That means what the workers are going to do is they're going to go to their bosses and ask for raises. Now, from the firm's point of view, they're not thrilled about this because more wages mean higher costs from the firm's perspective. I already talked about how firms react to higher costs. They react to higher costs by slashing production. Same story we had before, where if you have some goods that are just barely break even or a little bit profitable, once you have these higher costs, now they become unprofitable. You don't want that. So you don't want to lose money on those goods, so you don't produce them. So that's the SRAS curve responds to expected future prices. Let me stop there before my phone runs out of space for the video, and we'll talk more about the SAD model in the next video.